Just so
Got
there's
it.
no doubt about that. Appreciate that everybody joined. We have Carolyn here. She and Kenneth had, a couple weeks ago had talked about outer space photography, and Carolyn's going to give us a talk about the Griffith Park Observatory. If you've been out in LA, it's hard to miss the observatory. It sits up on a hill overlooking the LA basin. If you look at the picture of Jim Brown, you can see the lights down in the hill down below. And it's, as Carol will go through some of the history, been here about as much as anything in LA these days. It's one of the oldest public buildings that's out there, but greatly remodeled. So she's going to take us through the history of Mr. Griffith. We did a chat the other day and learned some interesting things about him, and try to take you through the time of the observatory. So I'm going to mute. Well, first I've got to make Carolyn a co-host, so she
I was
can
about to ask. Yeah.
and then I'm going to just mute folks. If you have questions or anything, throw them in the chat, and then feel free to chat at the end. So I think Carolyn needs to unmute herself, and with that, I'll turn it over to her.
All right, and I'm going to set up here. Hang on, got to do this. All right. Well, yeah, Griffith Observatory is kind of interesting because here I am in Colorado. I don't live in Los Angeles, but I spent a fair chunk of my career a few years ago working with Griffith Observatory.
Just so you know,
Most
Carolyn,
of you.
all the notes are showing. We're not seeing the main.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Slide.
Well, then let me stop that. I didn't realize that. Let's see here. Stop share. I clicked the wrong one. Let's see here. This happens occasionally, doesn't it? Share screen. See, now if I do this way, hold on, bear with me here. So I can't actually go into PowerPoint until I do this.
For me, when I do it, I bring up PowerPoint and then share the screen and go into slideshow mode.
That's what I'm trying to do, and it went into the wrong side. So let's see here. Yeah, this worked perfectly the other day. Pardon me?
So it worked so well on Thursday.
Yeah, so now what you're seeing is my notes, right?
No, now we're seeing, now I see the notes, yes. But down at the
right.
very bottom, there's a little, yep.
Yeah, I'm hitting that, but you're probably still seeing my notes.
Still seeing the notes.
All right, what's going on here? This worked perfectly the other day. Stop share. Sorry about that. It's wanting me to invite somebody. Okay, so here we are. No, I can't. All right, so sorry. This worked perfectly the other day. So what's going on here? Share screen.
All right, we see your desktop.
Yeah, and that's what we want. So then I do this. No, I don't do that. What about that? All right. Okay.
Cooking with.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, there's like 15 million boxes open. All right. So most of my career, I spent a lot of time writing planetarium shows and full dome shows for digital theaters. But I've been a long-time science writer, and I got involved with doing the Griffith exhibits. Basically, in 2005, they contacted me. Someone contacted me about wanting to need a writer for the Griffith Observatory. And I'd been out there a few times as a planetarium person, and so I became the senior exhibition writer for Griffith when it was renovated. And that renovation actually began in 2002. I didn't come onto the picture until about 2005. But that was the very first exhibition I ever did, and I then went on to do more for NASA and excuse me, California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco. And the latest one was the Shanghai Astronomical Museum, which is opening up like right now, I think, provided that the pandemic's going to allow them. But Griffith was my first one, and so that's what I'm going to focus on today. And as I mentioned in the opening that I sent to Bill, it's the director Ed Krupp often calls it the hood ornament of Los Angeles, and I didn't really appreciate that until I was driving up 5 one time and saw it and going, yeah, it does kind of look like a hood ornament. But one of the aspects of these talks that you guys have been giving over the last few months since I've started joining them was this historical context you all give for your topics. And so, with that in mind, I want to start with a little historical context for Griffith. Now, 2 weeks ago, we were looking at the Great Columbian Exposition, and it reminded me a lot of the material that I had to read through to start writing about the history of Griffith. And the Great Columbian Exposition sort of took place in this age of scientific advancement when things first were beginning to pop in science, and also for the continued expansion of the American industrial machine, the continued expansion westward, um, that really started happening in the mid 19th century and moved forward. And the roots for Griffith are really set in that time period, mostly the mid to the late 19th century, where you had the invention of the electric light had happened, the development of telecommunications, telephone, radio were just beginning. You had the first powered flights and blimps, and then the Wright brothers took their flight, and the age of aero sort of took off. And about the same time, observatories in the US were also going through this parallel development of basically using the new technologies to further the science. Before that time, observatories really didn't have cameras, they didn't have any kind of special instruments. Mostly they were particularly in the 18th century, sort of you used them for navigation, you used them to learn latitude and longitude, for timekeeping, for calendar making. And rich and wealthy people would build these things. And there's a whole history I won't get into too much, other than to say that in Europe, if one king had an observatory, the other king had to have an observatory. And it kind of went from there. Wealthy people would build these things. Those were the roots of astronomy, of modern astronomy. But for astronomy in the 18th or the 19th and 20th century, the invention of photography was a big step forward. So you weren't just taking your eye to the eyepiece, you were actually attaching a camera to it. And there was also the science of something called spectroscopy. And this was a technique for breaking down light into its wavelengths. And then you can tell some things about an object by looking at the light. So the history of observatory has its roots in the rise of American professional astronomy, but also with these developments, but also with the rambunctious mining history of the late 1800s. Everybody was heading west in the 1800s to make their fortune. And also, then following that was the development in real estate, which made a lot of people really wealthy, and things like that. So, and Griffith also has a little bit of Disney history, as we all know, and has a long-standing connection to Hollywood and the TV industry. So there's a little bit of everything going into Griffith. Now, the history really begins elsewhere in the country. As I mentioned, there's a time when observatories in North America were starting to sprout up all over the place. So they were being built on the East Coast. There's the Harvard College Observatory, which you see here on the left. Another one was developed around the same time, the Maria Mitchell Observatory in Nantucket. These were places where it was pretty dark. You could do observing pretty well. The U.S. Naval Observatory was built in D.C., which was originally intended as an astronomy observatory to support navigation and timekeeping. Some of you might remember ever seeing a ball dropping down on the top of that at noontime or 1 o'clock. I mean, we don't remember it, but there were pictures of it. Other colleges started building them. So the University of Michigan and Pennsylvania and Denver, places like that were building them. Yerkes Observatory on the right, which was built in Williams Bay, Wisconsin in the late 1800s, was part of the University of Chicago until just a few years ago. And it was the first to be considered a laboratory of astronomy, where you're actually doing science, science as a laboratory technique. With the rise of spectroscopy, again, that allows astronomers to break light into its wavelengths, and photography, they could now record more accurately what they saw and what they detected through the telescope. And so astronomy as a science is really starting to take really huge leaps forward. Just notice in that picture, the lower right, on the left here, oh, I don't have my pointer on, hang on a second. On the left here is Professor E. E. Barnard, and over here is a kind of a familiar looking gentleman. This was a meeting at Yerkes in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and here is Albert Einstein. I don't know the names of all these people, but there was a fair cross section of American astronomers at that time. So, unfortunately, with the rise of lighting and things like that, Astronomers who were now finally getting their chance to do precision astronomy and astrophysics now had to start putting up with light pollution from these newly lit up cities nearby. But they also had to put up with crappy weather. So Williams Bay, if any of you have ever been there, can have some pretty crappy weather. It's right on the lake shore, and it's Wisconsin. So they would basically not be able to observe for a fair chunk of time throughout the year. So astronomers began looking west for better conditions and less populated areas like Arizona and California, to name a couple. And they started looking around for money to build observatories out in these kind of, you know, empty places. And wealthy philanthropists were the ones that they went to do that. So that's how, back at the turn of the 19th century, astronomy became a big thing in California. The weather helped a lot, and most of you know that conditions along the coast can permit some fairly clear skies most of the time, except during June or when there are fires. And particularly in Southern California, it was very nice. That marine layer will roll in, and it just cuts off all the light from the city. And so places like Mount Wilson can do their observing. Now, Mount Wilson, if you haven't been there, is a few miles north of Los Angeles. It's home to several telescopes. Two of them, for the longest time, were the largest telescopes in the world for their time. And they'd been built by astronomers who had cashed a lot of money from philanthropists and from the government to build these observatories in places where they could do precision astronomy. And they were also really inspired by these large telescopes that had been built in places like Yerkes. So the move west gave astronomers access to better to these large telescopes that they could, look deeper into space with. Allowed them to build large instruments on Mount Wilson and also up at Lick Observatory near San Francisco. Later on, some of you have been to Palomar. You may have seen those telescopes. Those were more of a 1900s development. But we're going to focus on Mount Wilson because that's part of our story. If you're interested in Mount Wilson's history, I've included the URL here because it's a really interesting story. A friend of mine named Mike, I just spaced his last name out, wrote it, did a lot of research into it. You'll see pictures of them dragging large telescope mirrors using donkeys and carts up the road to Mount Wilson. It's pretty interesting. The first major telescope on Mount Wilson was the 60-inch, which you see here on the right. And for a time, that was the world's largest telescope. Then they built the 100-inch Hooker telescope, which took its turn as the largest telescope for a couple of decades. But the 60-inch is what played a role in Griffith's founding. So there was this young man who had immigrated to the U.S. and Wales in 1865, and at the age of 15, and his name was Griffith J. Griffith. He made his way to California, as everybody did, and he ultimately made his fortune in mining and real estate. And he was something of a wild guy. He made a ton of money. He traveled a lot. He bought property. But as Bill mentioned, and I told him, Griffith had something of a violent streak. He ended up shooting his wife in the head. She did survive. She forgave him, but she also divorced him. And he spent some time in jail for that. A couple of years, I think, he spent in jail for that. But somewhere along the way, he also managed to make friends with astronomers up at Mount Wilson. And it turns out he'd always been something of a stargazer. So one of his trips up to the mountain, he got a chance to look through the 60-inch telescope. And that was what made a big change in his life. Mount Wilson experience basically touched him in a way that he had never been, I guess. People that knew him said he really had changed. And this is his quote. He said afterwards, if all mankind could look through that telescope, it would change the world. And he decided he really wanted other people to have the chance to look through a telescope as well. So he had, as I mentioned, purchased a lot of real estate, and he'd bought this large tract of land in 1882. Some of you who live there may recognize this area. It was called Rancho Las Feliz. And during his travels in Europe, he had also noticed that there had been a great many parks. He visited a lot of parks. And he decided that Los Angeles needed to have a park too. So in 1896, he donated this land so that Los Angeles could have its own great park. And eventually that is what became known as Griffith Park. And just as a little aside, we all know the Griffith Park Carousel was where Walt Disney sat and wondered about building a park where kids and parents could enjoy things together. So it turns out that Griffith also had ideas about ensuring a family experience for visitors to the park, but on top of Mount Hollywood. So Griffith's gaze through the telescope basically gave Los Angeles a lot of land to be able to do this park. But it also inspired him to endow the building of an observatory. People couldn't get up to Mount Wilson all the time. In fact, it was discouraged to do that because that's the place where astronomers went. But he wanted to build something that the people could have, so like the People's Telescope. And so he planned this thing, an observatory and a hall of science that would be on Mount Hollywood inside of his tract of land that he donated. And in 1912, he gave the city even more money to build this place, this public observatory. So he gave about $100,000, and at that time, that was, I don't know what that would be worth today, quite a bit. But he wanted a place where people could come up from the city, see the sky, look through a telescope, maybe hear a lecture or see a film about the latest scientific discoveries. So after a little bit of lobbying, the city accepted this, and he and a group of advisors assembled a team to draw up plans for this building. And they went along for quite a while, but unfortunately, Griffith didn't live to see it created. He died in 1919. But in his will, he left the property and the directions for the building of the observatory and also the Greek Theater, if you've been to that. That's down the hill from Griffith. Well, time went by. We have the Depression going on. Things weren't happening as quickly as it could happen. But so it wasn't really until the 1930s that the building that we now know of as Griffith today was begun to be built. There was a Griffith Trust put together, which was in charge of building this. They brought in astronomers and architects to help plan this structure. For any of you who are architects, the people who were the main architectural firm on this were John C. Austin and Frederick Ashley. And they used preliminary plans that Caltech physicists had gotten involved in creating. They pulled in everybody, Caltech, USC, anybody that could come in and advise on this. So Caltech physicist Edward Kurth got involved, and there was an amateur telescope maker named Russell Porter, who most amateur astronomers know about. He also contributed plans to this. And they came up with this beautiful terracotta-clad building, which you see here in the architect's renderings. And of course, the designs and the plans changed a bit over time. For example, instead of doing a film theater, they decided to put in a planetarium under the central dome. But before they could even begin building, there was kind of another problem that's cropped up, and it forced them to change their building plans. There was an earthquake. It's not uncommon to have earthquakes in California. But the level of destruction, this struck in Long Beach, convinced the Griffith Observatory Trust that they needed to change the plans for the building, and particularly for the materials. A terracotta just wasn't going to cut it. You'd have one good shake and everything would come falling down. So instead, they created this building that was solid concrete walls poured over a foundation and then it reinforced by rebar, which is the building that we see today. Here's Griffith Observatory under construction. I think this is the year before it was building. So you can see the roofs of the observatory dome. So these are observatory domes. This is the planetarium dome, and then here are those foot-thick walls. So those are still unfinished. And then here it is getting closer to completion. I like the fact that you can't see any of Los Angeles here except for this little corner right down here. But big issue. I mean, you've got one road going up there, and they had to sequence all these trucks to go up there to get it done. Come on, here we go. And here it is on opening day, May 14th, 1935. So the design is this basic Beaux-Arts style with Greek design influences on it that was very popular at the time. Again, the planetarium is under the center dome, and then there is they had built it with a brand new Zeiss Mark II planetarium instrument, planetarium had just been invented in 1923, really, at least the modern planetarium. The first one was installed in Jena, Germany in 23. The first modern planetarium in the U.S. had a Zeiss. That was actually the Adler Planetarium in Chicago, and that opened in 1930, and the New York Hayden opened in 1933. So not to be outdone, Los Angeles is going to have a Zeiss in its planetarium. So as soon as Griffith opened, the director invited students up for field trips. It became a very popular place for field trips. And in fact, those continued until the closure in 2002 and resumed again in 2006 and then stopped again last year because of the pandemic. But the idea is that every student in the Southern California area can come up there for a visit, and I think in 5th or 6th grade, whenever they get that astronomy unit, and spend an afternoon at the planetarium and the observatory and learn about astronomy. The observatory also started doing publications. They did a great deal of astronomy outreach. In 1937, they began publishing a monthly magazine called the Griffith Observer, which you can still get today. And a couple of years later, they began producing Astrorama sky charts, which you can still get off their website. And today they also do a podcast, so they keep up with the times. They have the Griffith Sky Report, which gives information about what's up in the sky. So here's a picture of the first planetarium instrument they had. It's a Zeiss Mark II, which was built in Jena, Germany. It was replaced in 1964 with a Mark IV. So the first one was built in Jena. The second one was built in Oberkochen, and there's kind of an interesting story behind that. That when Germany was divided, the Zeiss company was also divided into East German and West German counterparts. So here in the U.S., we had to buy from Oberkochen. Everybody else could buy from Jena. Now the entire company is reformed back into one company, and they're in Jena, and they have quite a plant in that area. Newly built Griffith Observatory also had a 12-inch Zeiss refractor, and that was what helped fulfill Griffith's dream of creating a place where you and me, any ordinary person, could go up there and observe the sky. You just put your eye up to the eyepiece and you can see what's up. Now, I don't have the exact numbers, but I talked to Mark Pine about this, and it's probably well over 9 million people have looked through that telescope since opening, and no other observatory in the world, public observatory in the world, has that kind of record. Here's a picture taken a few years after opening with people lined up to look through the telescope. The guy with the fellow with the armband on, Griffith has always had kind of an army of guides that I think other museums call them docents, they call them guides up there. And they help people look through the telescope. They give them information about the exhibits. They help them into the theaters, whatever they need to do. A long line of people have served as Griffith guides, and many of them have gone on to become astronomers and filmmakers and teachers and what have you. They've all, and I know some, a couple of them were my professors in college. So when you go up to Griffith, the first thing you see when you walk up from the parking lot is called the Astronomer's Monument, with statues of, so there's 6 statues: Hipparchus, Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, and William Herschel. These are all people who contributed to the history of astronomy on each side. Now, this was built just shortly after Griffith was, using Works Progress Administration money, and it was finally installed in 1934. On top of it is this thing right here is an armillary sphere, and we mentioned those the other day when Carol was talking about that clock that's at the Getty. So this is an armillary sphere. It gives information about celestial latitude, longitude, and the ecliptic, of just basically positions of things in the sky. Those were actually first invented in Greece and China, and their use spread throughout the ancient world. So this is kind of a monument to the ancient ways of doing astronomy. Excuse me, let me get a drink of water here. Now, next to the monument down here is a sundial, and that actually helps you tell time throughout the day. So another ancient instrument. So this entire building is about astronomy. It's about doing astronomy with the eye, looking up, seeing what you can see without a telescope. And then you walk inside and you can look through a telescope, and then you use exhibits to learn what astronomers have learned about the sky using telescopes and modern instruments. Today, there's a scale model of the solar system engraved into the ground with bronze markers along here, and you can just step along and see where everything is. Over here on the west side, which I'll show you a little later on, is something called the Gottlieb Transit Corridor, which is another astronomical instrument. It's a line north-south, and you basically use it to watch as things go overhead, directly overhead. They transit overhead. So it crosses that line, and then there's a little marker that you can sort of look at to see where it's crossing, and that tells you how high it is in the sky. The transit corridor leads to a lower level entrance, which will also get you to the gift shop. That's a very important part of this place. It's called the Stellar Emporium. And then the cafe at the end of the universe is a Wolfgang Puck managed cafe, which has some of the best brownies in the universe as far as I'm concerned. I'll get to most of those a little bit later, but I just wanted to tell you what's out there. And then this is an elevator for ADA compliance. People can use the elevator to go up and down. So once the observatory opened in the 30s, it served the public for many years, and people were very familiar with the planetarium. Here's an image of the first director, Dr. Dinsmore Alter, and he's showing off the Zeiss planetarium instrument to a group of visitors. And nobody at Griffith or anybody that's ever worked there knows what those women were doing there. They think it might have been a ladies' club or something, but they were there and he's explaining how it all works. Dr. Alter was one of the first to create planetarium programs that focused on the evening skies. They weren't pre-recorded; they were live people giving talks, looking at the evening skies, the moon, the planets, eclipses, and whatever else is happening. He began publication of the Griffith Observer, which I mentioned, and he also was the first one to start these school visits, which like 50,000 kids a year were visiting Griffith Observatory. Indoors, the original facility had exhibits that explained the basics of observational astronomy, what you can look at with the naked eye, like planets, stars. You can't really see a galaxy, maybe one besides our own. There's a Tesla coil in there. We're not sure exactly why that's so important, but it's a really huge draw. Everybody goes to see the Tesla coil. There's a Foucault pendulum, which helps teach about how the Earth rotates on its axis. The pendulum hangs down from a rotunda today it's called the W.M. Keck Rotunda. And on that ceiling are painted a series of murals by the artist Hugo Ballin. And he, in fact, provided the observatory's earliest link with Hollywood. So Hugo began his career as an artist, and he was a muralist living back in Pennsylvania. But he started getting these commissions, and he created murals for places like the Wisconsin State Capitol. In 1917, he took a job at Goldwyn Pictures in New Jersey, and there he was an art director and a production designer. And then eventually he came to Hollywood and began directing and producing silent films. So there's a poster of one of his films. Mabel Ballin was his wife. She was an actress that he met there. After the advent of talkies, though, after the beginning of talkies, he decided to leave the film world and really wanted to start working on murals again. So you can see his murals at the LA County Hospital, Burbank City Hall. He did some for the 1932 Summer Olympics, and of course, those works at Griffith. Here's a shot of his mural at Burbank City Hall. Maybe some of you have seen that. Here's another one at the LA County Hospital, which I think is now called LAC and USC Medical Center. So they hired him in the 1930s to paint the murals at Griffith to illustrate early sky-related myths using classical figures. So here you can see Atlas holding the zodiac signs, followed by the Pleiades, which is a star cluster. The god Jupiter, gods of Jupiter and Venus, and the four seasons are there. Saturn is there, Mercury's there, and there's a person holding the Star of Bethlehem, and there's a moon and a comet. So here's the moon, here's the comet. I'm trying to find the Pleiades. I can't quite see them, but it's go in there sometime and just study it. They've actually restored these. It's quite pretty. This part shows the rotunda with some of the other wall murals, and I'm going to show you those next. So these are close-ups of the wall murals just below the rotunda. So Ballin painted a series. He was asked to do this series depicting the progress of science, the themes of the time, which is this first one, then astronomy, aeronautics, navigation, metallurgy and electricity, mathematics and physics, geology and biology, and engineering. I thought it was kind of interesting. We want to make sure we had engineering in there. So these all illustrate the path of knowledge that humanity has taken through the ages as our science progressed. And that's what part of what they wanted to show at Griffith was, here are these paths that we've all taken from the very earliest prehistoric times where we studied the sky to the modern age. Well, for many years, these murals and the exhibits at Griffith provided a wonderful cultural and scientific place to visit for people from around the world. They came from everywhere to look at it. And the mountain itself has always been a really great place to hike. And I'm not sure how many of you have hiked it. I know that the late council member Tom LaBonge, who was a big fan of this place, hiked those mountains every day. And that was just his thing to do. But they were also a location for some kind of interesting other purposes besides hiking. During World War II, the mountain was used by military spotters in case of an invasion. Nothing ever happened, but they were up there doing this. So at this point, there were some other things. Let's see here. Oh, yeah. So this being Hollywood in the center of the film world for so many years, Griffith was also influenced by and played a role in entertainment. And surprisingly enough, the astronauts also came here to train. So what I want to do now is crash out of this and play a little clip from a video called "The Once and Future Griffith." I think if you go up there, you can still see this video in their one of their theaters. But this is a little clip where the director of the observatory and a couple of really cool guest stars talk about these two roles. So let me crash out of here and stop sharing this and find the movie, which is right here. And then I'm going to share again. Can you see the movie? Can somebody tell me if you can see it?
During World War II, soldiers were stationed there to look out for enemy ships and planes that might attack Los Angeles. Fortunately,
Still World War II soldiers, and now it's a crowd going into the observatory.
Can you hear it?
No.
Okay, because I forgot to share sound. Hold on a minute. Everything but that one thing.
Yeah, why they make that an option, I don't know.
Well, hold on. I just need to start over here. All right. I'm going to share the screen again. Sorry about that. Share sound. Yeah, they should just make that like.
Might attack Los Angeles. Fortunately, that never happened.
Can you hear it now?
Yeah.
After the war, the observatory became the home of big dreams. It was a place to learn what the world's leading scientists were thinking about space travel.
One of the best examples of this is, in fact, the first director's transformation of planetarium programming. And that was Dr. Dinsmore Alter. And his interest in traveling to the moon, long before we ever actually did that, prompted him to have contrived special effects projectors that created zoom effects and such that gave the audience the feeling that they were leaving the Earth, traveling through space. Then they get close to the moon, then they'd land on the moon, and they would be in the environment of the lunar mountains and craters. Well, this was, in fact, an extraordinary development.
In the process of showing visitors the stars, Griffith Observatory became one itself. Its first appearance in Hollywood movies was, oddly enough, as an empire 25,000 feet below the surface of the Earth.
For many days before the end of our Earth, we will look into the night sky and notice a star. As this star approaches us,
Jim Stark.
The observatory's big break came in Rebel Without a Cause, starring James Dean, where it was for the first time portrayed as what it actually was, an observatory.
will turn.
I was just thinking that. Once you've been up there, you know you've been someplace.
In a burst of gas and fire.
Over 200 films, TV shows, and music videos have been shot at Griffith Observatory.
Certainly is a lot of switches.
Yeah, quite intricate.
Despite its willingness to play along in movie make-believe, the observatory is a place where people have always turned to find out what's real.
Griffith Planetarium was, the preferred planetarium, was the one which the Apollo crews used most to become familiar with the sky and the navigation stars. The training we got at Griffith Planetarium was really essential. If you're upside down or sideways, and instead of being in the northern hemisphere, you're somewhere in the southern hemisphere, and the sky is at 3 o'clock in the morning, I mean, are you going to recognize a star? So with the planetarium, we literally became familiar with the total sky. And finally, we ended up designing this seat with a hole in the board in front of us that allowed you to see only the same amount of sky that you would see if you look through the telescope. And that's very difficult. If you hold up your hand in front of you at night and look at the sky through just a hole that big, about that far in front of your face, that's pretty tough to figure out where you are in the sky. And that was what we did in the planetarium.
That's a neat space tie to have Leonard Nimoy narrating it. You're muted, Carolyn.
Yeah, I'm going to get to him in a minute. He was actually a big supporter of Griffith Observatory. All right.
There we are.
All right. Here we go. So, as I mentioned in there have been a lot of movies filmed there. This is a list that I got off of Wikipedia, which is badly in need of updating because it doesn't have all of the TV shows that they've done there, like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Criminal Minds and Dragnet, Mission Impossible. The Monkees filmed up there, if you remember him. The Simpsons did a couple of episodes mentioning it. New Adventures of Wonder Woman. Dancing with the Stars did a show up there. Top Chef has been there. Wonder Years. Some of you who watched The Big Bang Theory probably remember them recreated that. When Bill and I talked the other day, I was telling him about how they it looks like they filmed it inside of Griffith, but they didn't. Griffith does not allow any filming inside their theater anymore. So the producers for The Big Bang Theory actually came and recreated that on the soundstage. Part of that set. It looks, when I saw it, I thought, oh, how did they get to film in there? Because it just looks so real. They've also hosted music awards there. A couple of years ago, there was a Burberry fashion show held on the front lawn. It's been on album covers and comics. It's really just the location shooting spot, one of them for choice for TV and video in the Los Angeles area. Excuse me a minute, I need to. Right. Well, in 1964, Griffith Planetarium underwent a renovation and they put in the new Zeiss Mark IV planetarium instrument. And they also put in updated projection systems and new seating. So, as a little aside, the planetarium shows in the 60s really were kind of a combo of live content and you put up slides. So when I first started doing planetariums, we had slide projectors and we had banks of them all around the planetarium. And this was in the 70s. And they would be automated with these computerized systems. And then later on, we moved to full dome video where we just paint the dome with video. And there are still planetariums that still do slides. There's been sort of this long evolution of going to video. At Griffith, the shows have always been given by a live presenter. And in the beginning, those talks were just simply slideshows and other visual material. And then they would use the planetarium instrument to show the sky itself, to talk about whatever astronomy topics that the lecture was about. And that all began to change then in the early 2000s with the advent of full dome video. So, as we'll get to in a bit, Griffith also went to full dome video. But for many years, the live slideshow and the lecture were Griffith's stock and trade. That's what all the guides learned how to do, all the presenters. That's what you came up to hear if you were a student coming up to take a class. And of course, in the evenings, there were the laser shows. Bill asked me about the laser shows, and those began in the late 1970s and continued until the renovation began. And in fact, the fellow that started those was Ivan Dreyer, who died a couple of years ago. He started Laserium, and that's where he started some of his first shows. So 67 years after it was built, Griffith had been basically loved to death. It was not falling apart. I mean, you really can't knock apart foot-thick walls, but the roof was leaking. The exterior had paint coming off of it. Electrical wiring had to be updated. The exhibits needed to be replaced. The planetarium theater needed another update. The telescopes needed attention. The whole building needed to be expanded because the director, Ed Krupp, decided they really needed to have some additional exhibits. So they closed it. It was time for a renovation. And so that closed down in 2002. And workers began the process of this $93 million upgrade. And this is how it looked before the excavations began. Now, there were some challenges to this. First of all, they knew they wanted more space. But the building exterior had to remain this Beaux-Arts style with the Greek influences on it. There wasn't really room to expand it unless you went out onto this lawn, and that would have meant moving the monument. It was just a number of problems with expanding front and back. They didn't want to ruin that line. So along with all the other work that they had to do to restore the building, they decided to excavate underneath this front lawn that you see and clear out space for a whole new floor level and build a new exhibition space. So that's all that, that's sort of the overview of what they had to do. They ended up excavating out about 30,000 cubic yards of dirt to create this new space. So here's what it looked like. Excuse me. Darn, I don't know why this happened. To create this is what it looked like a couple of years after it closed. So down here is where let's see, do I still have a pointer? Yeah. And down here is where they were going to add new exhibit space. Underneath here is where they had to add a new floor, but this is the first of the exhibition that they did. So the renovation partnership included, but was not limited to, the Los Angeles Department of Parks and Recreation, their public works, a company called Pfeiffer Partners architectural firm, the Friends of the Observatory, which is now known as the Griffith Observatory Foundation, and that's been a real friends group. Actually, they raise money for the place. They actually help put on the kids shows, the visits from the schools. Their company in New York called C&G Partners for exhibit design, Maltby for exhibit fabrication, Carl Zeiss of Vienna, Germany for the planetarium projector, Evans and Sutherland Computer Corporation, now owned by COSM, for the video system, and Spitz Incorporated for the dome. Construction was Amoroso Construction, and there were a whole handful of political figures that were involved as well. Because when you're going to go ask for $93 million, you are going to go to the government for some of it, at least. And so James Hahn was involved, Antonio Villaraigosa was involved, Adam Schiff was involved, and the late Tom LaBonge, as well as Leonard Nimoy, who went with these people, and Camille Lombardo, who was the head of photo at the time, out to Congress to lobby for money. And apparently it was really successful, because the minute Leonard Nimoy walked in, all the Trekkies in the room just flocked over to talk to him. They took him down to the congressional cafeteria, and I think that was in large part what helped them get some of the money that they needed. The $93 million covered all the expansion, the renovation, the exhibit development, my paycheck, and all the other things that would be ancillary to that. Photo raised about a third of the money, and the rest came from public and private sources, including FEMA. So here's what it looked like during renovation from the air. The scaffolding on the main dome is there to facilitate a complete renovation of that dome. They had to waterproof it. Every time it rained, water would leak in through that dome, and they'd have this series of little buckets all around the floor and the floors underneath to catch all the rain. The other two domes were also renovated and cleaned. And as you can see, there's that big dig on the north side of the building over here. So that's where they were building the new exhibit space. And everything was going really well until they got into the excavation, and they had to face a big problem. Griffith actually sits very near the toe of a fault line that lies within the Hollywood earthquake fault zone. So they couldn't continue building. They had to stabilize the area where they were excavating to make it safer. And while they were doing that, they had to shore up the existing building. So here's where it gets interesting. Oh, let me show you a close-up of these scaffolding here. This is the scaffolding that they went through the dome. They actually erected it inside the dome and then passed it through the dome to the outside so that the workers could get up here and work on things. Here's a little bit of a close-up to it. And so they have the scaffolding and all the boards, and that's where they went up to. They lifted the dome off completely and then cleaned it off at the same time, and then put in all of the waterproof liners and reinforced the top, and then put everything back on there, and then they had to finish cleaning off the copper. So to dig underneath and they had to do blasting underneath the building to create a whole new floor underneath the existing building. So they had to do something that would scare the crap out of almost any construction person. They severed Griffith from its foundation, and they jacked it up on hydraulic lifts. So you can see those on the left. On the right is a walkway into the building from the front on the lower level from the north side. And on either side over here, you can see there's some kind of openings. You could look basically underneath the building to see the hydraulic jacks. And you could see where the building had been severed off of its foundations. So here and then further back. So on my first visit there, actually, after I took on the writing, they took us all out there, and we had to put on hard hats and go look at everything. We could walk up that ramp and see underneath, and it was pretty amazing. So that's what it looked like when you look through. Over here is what it looked like when you look through those doors. There is a portion of this video that the engineer for the city of Los Angeles is talking about how they got absolutely no sleep for almost a month while this thing was jacked up on hydraulic jacks. They were so worried about an earthquake happening. Well, once they stabilized the fault area and the building got it reconnected to the foundations, they started to pour concrete for the underground gallery. And this will eventually, we'll get to see this. This will all be buried under the lawn again. And it would have sidewalks. So this whole roof of the complex had to be strong enough to hold several fire trucks if they had to come up in the event of a fire. So, but there could be no large, there's like one pole here, but there are no other large poles holding it up. So it had to be specially engineered for this. I believe the observatory deputy director had said that this was a continuous pour for nearly a week. It might have been a little bit longer than that. So here's the roof after it was done, after the pour. This is an underground exhibition space. And here's another view of the underground area before the pour began. I meant to show you this. The curved wall at the lower left is now the back of a theater, which we're going to visit in a little bit. And here's a view of the excavation looking to the northwest. You can see the Hollywood sign. And this is the astronomer's monument. It's actually covered up so that it doesn't get damaged during the construction. Now, during the construction, they did go back and restore the astronomer's monument. There was a lot of pollution on there. They needed to repaint it. They also did the same thing to the exterior of the main building. So here it is with the excavation complete, roof's buried again. They haven't put in the lawn yet. I think this is the first time that I visited. The second time that I visited, we went out and this was all in place. The sidewalks are back in, but they haven't put in the landscaping. So all this is going on in California. There's a curatorial team led by Dr. Krupp. They'd been working on exhibition content planning. So you don't just say, okay, we're going to put the moon over here, and we're going to put the stars over here and all this. You actually have to have sort of a storyline. And so they did the exhibition content planning before I came on. And then I came on in 2005. I got that phone call from a former colleague that told me that Griffith was looking for an exhibit writer. And that person needed to basically move to New York City and live with the exhibit design company. I was living in Boston at the time, so I said, well, could I commute? And they said yes. So we got in touch. They brought me on board in April of 2005. And my job was basically to write the equivalent of a beginner's astronomy book, as if the observatory itself was telling the stories about all the things that it observed and it could observe. So eventually my nickname became Voice of the Observatory, or VOTO. And I still get emails from people at Griffith, Dear VOTO. The main theme of the building is turning visitors into observers. And so that's one of the reasons why they want to tell this story. Every aspect of the facility, from the outdoor exhibits to the indoor ones, to the planetarium and the telescopes, they're all there to fulfill that theme. So all those words I wrote embody that theme. And they were spread out across about 160 exhibit panels, maybe 170 throughout the building, plus video installations. So I was embedded with the New York design firm C&G Partners. My contract was with Friends of the Observatory, so I kind of had two bosses. And this is all of us. This is part of our design team on the left. I don't remember all their names. Sarah, I think. This is Sam. That's I can't remember her name. Sorry, she was one of my main designers. And then over here is Bettina, who was the lead designer. This is Mark Pine, who is now the deputy director, and this is me. And we're basically looking over printouts of what we have just designed for that week. So I was embedded with C&G. This is actually kind of interesting. Both Mark and I were. We were told that was a first. There's very few times that any design firm wants a client embedded during a large project, but in this case, they agreed with it. And they had the office space, so I had a little desk there and a computer. I commuted from Boston 4 days a week. He came back and forth from New York and Los Angeles. We had an astronomy consultant on board, Dr. Bruce Bohannon, who was one of my professors from the University of Colorado when I was an undergrad. And then I could call any of the curators. I could talk to scientists at UCLA and Caltech and USC and JPL, whoever I needed. I would just say, I need to talk to somebody about meteorites. And they would line up 3 people and I'd talk to them. And so that my job was to sit there and just work with these guys. They would do a layout. They would tell me how many words I had in a space. And then I would say, I can't possibly do it in that many words. Can I have 10 more, or whatever? And we would go back and forth with each other about what we could make. But we did have a design template that we had to fill in. And so we were trying to do about a 50-50 art to text ratio so that you weren't totally overwhelmed with text or art, but they complemented each other. And I sort of learned the language of design from these people, and they learned a little about astronomy from me. We also had meetings with the curatorial team in Los Angeles. And this is a picture of Mark with one of his highly technical drawings about the orbit of Uranus. They were held in a building that's near the LA Zoo. If you go by there, going sort of towards Griffith Park and look to the left, there's a big parking lot and there's several trailers. Those were the offices where the observatory team relocated during the renovation. We had our meetings there. We couldn't have the meetings at the observatory. It was being worked on. So we'd have these lengthy curatorial meetings about every aspect of the exhibit. I'd fly out. We'd spend a day or two going over whatever we needed to work on. As a writer, I had to get a sense of what the team was thinking, what they wanted, what their thought was about what the public would perceive. And then they would give me feedback on the latest iteration of whatever text I'd written. And of course, we'd have to talk over if there was any new discoveries, we'd have to figure out, can we fit those into what we've got existing already? The overarching goal was to make these exhibits evergreen so that the observatory would not be swapping out exhibits every year because they're fairly expensive to do. The exhibit design process began a couple of years before I came on board. The actual rating and layout began in about 2005, May of 2005. Fabrication began in late summer and continued up until the opening. In fact, I was writing stuff the day before I got on the plane to fly out for the opening. And then we did a little bit more afterwards as well. It was very intense. So just to give you an idea, most of you who are designers or architects are probably familiar with these scenes. We would mock up the exhibits using the infamous foam core and paper, where they would cut out something that looked like what it was going to look like. We would print out, okay, here's this picture of the moon we're going to talk about, what it looks like. And then I would give them some words, they'd print them out and paste them up. And we just sort of do a layout on the foam core. We had a crew of about a dozen designers. We also had an image wrangler. I had a research person that I could say, okay, I know that this part, but can you go look up this part for me? I had a copy editor. Our copy editor was actually an editor for Teen Vogue magazine. She was totally outside of the entire process. All she came in to do was make sure that the English and the punctuation were correct and this sort of thing. I worked from home on copy so I worked from this in New York from April 2005 to mid-December 2005. And then after that, I worked at home. I would vet designs and layout. They would send me PDFs. I'd look at them. We do edits. And this all, again, happened until about a week before the grand opening in October 2006. Like I said, I sent some of the last exhibit panels just before I got on the plane to go out there. So in the end, we came up with a pretty impressive set of evergreen exhibitions that are still there in place, and I think they only have to make minor upgrades and modifications. So I'll give you a kind of a closer look at what the elements were that we used to tell the different stories that you'll find throughout the building. First, we had what we call primary panels. These are big freestanding panels that give a kind of a meta idea of what the given area is about. In the story in the museum, you can't tell one story. You can't walk through from A to B to C to D to E to get the whole story walking throughout the building. There are something like 5 or 6 entrances to the building. So you don't know where people are coming in, where they're going to start. So each area in itself is an enclosed story, but throughout the building it is not. So there were 12 of these primaries, and they would tell you that this is what this area is about. Then we had what we called wayside panels. They gave the most detail about a given topic. In this case, it's how astronomers use adaptive optics to correct for turbulence in the atmosphere. So these are pretty important storytelling units throughout the building. There are also guides around to answer questions. The people that can, say, okay, you tell them I don't understand, what does adaptive optics mean, and they'll talk to you. And there are about 150 of the waysides throughout the building. Some had 1 or 2 waysides, some had as many as 3 or 4. We talked a lot about the language of what they had to be. It had to be very approachable. Los Angeles area has, I think they said something like 30 different language groups in the area. So you can't, write these in 30 languages. They're in English, but they had to be in very good English. So these were written at about a 7th grade level. And we always had in mind that, at least I was thinking, I would give this to my dad. He was interested, but he wasn't educated in astronomy. So if he could read it and get it, then I knew that I was there with it. We also considered all those language groups. And often enough, if you had, say, this group from little, what is it called, little Yugoslavia or little Ukraine, or Korea or some Koreatown or something like that were coming in, or they spoke Spanish as a main language. Maybe one of the kids speaks English. So they're translating for mom and dad and grandpa and grandma and the aunts and uncles as they come in. So that language really had to be approachable. And I tried hard to avoid making it look dumbed down. It just had to be a very simple story. So the way that I did this was to create myself a character called Voto. And again, I created this character that was the observatory. It's kind of like an actor would do to get into the finer points of a character. And then I let the character tell the story. So it wasn't really me so much as it was this character Voto telling it. And it helped a lot that I was also studying acting at the time. I was in New York, right? I'm going to study acting in the evenings. And the whole process really gave me a chance to put some of the acting craft to work as well. So people would ask me how I handled criticism, when I would go to the curatorial meetings and they would be railing about this or that or the other. And they really didn't rail, they would get excited about things. But for me, it was really easy because I would just say, oh, they're criticizing Voto's work. They're not criticizing me. That was a way I got around that. But it worked really well. I was able to just pull it outside of my own thinking. They didn't have the director write it because they didn't want it to be in his voice. They wanted it to be in a voice that wasn't ascribable to one person, but to the building, to that character named Voto. Well, here's another wayside we created. It's about Galileo and his telescope. We went to a great deal of trouble to find someone who could create an exact replica of his real telescope. So this was made in Cambridge, Massachusetts by a company that does these replicas. And this is sort of a teaching tool that we use throughout the exhibits. Our actual artifacts and then videos if we can't get them throughout the observatory. So you'll look at this. This is sort of a brass holder for this. This is a pretty old-fashioned museum style, but it goes with the style of the building. And it's in keeping with the style of the time that Griffith was originally built. So there have been people that have come in who are museum designers who say, well, that's so old-fashioned. Why do you do that? Why don't you do this? And part of it is when you walk into the building, it sets a visual expectation for you of a time and a period. We want to keep that in these exhibits, even though the exhibits, of course, are talking about modern astronomy in many places. So the process to create all the exhibits was pretty straightforward. When I came in, they gave me a book that contained the exhibit development documents, the basic structure of every exhibit. We were working out, we were replacing some older exhibits, so those were fairly straightforward. But the whole new exhibition space, that was all brand new. We were in new territory with that one. So these images give you an idea of what some of the exhibits look like. These are in the Wilder Hall of the Eye, and every hall is named for a donor that has given money. Has an exhibit called Using the Sky, which tells you how people use the sky for navigation, calendar, timekeeping, and so on. Another one called Extending the Eye, which is this one right here, shows how we magnify our view using telescopes and other instruments. This one is called Observing in California, which shows the history of astronomy in California. This one's called Extending the Eye, which is essentially how we've used these it's called Beyond the Visible, and it shows how the universe looks in various wavelengths of light. And this is where spectroscopy and other techniques come in to show us what we can't see with the naked eye. And again, as I said, you can't tell a coherent story from one end of the building to the other. So you have to basically make each area its own main theme. So the Wilder Hall of the Eye is in the east wing of the original building. It talks about how we perceive with the eye. The Amundsen Hall of the Sky is in the west wing, and it focuses on things we see in the sky, on the very things that we see, ranging from the sun, the stars, the planets, galaxies, eclipses, day and night cycle, and so on. It also shows how the study of astronomy teaches us about where elements come from in the universe. The central rotunda, which we looked at a little bit ago, features the Ballon murals and the Foucault pendulum, which every time I've gone there's always been a crowd of people around that pendulum. They just watch it because it's going to do something, every few minutes. There's also a small area dedicated to the memory of Griffith. The museum, or the facility, also has some kind of really imaginative exhibits. This is called The Cosmic Connection. And I stole this right off their website because I don't have a really good picture of it, but it's one of the most unique exhibits I think I've ever seen for astronomy. It's a hallway that features a history of the universe depicted in the form of jewelry. And all this jewelry was collected by one woman, and then other people donated it. And each piece has a theme, and it fits in with the theme of the history of the universe. So it starts at the beginning and goes all the way to the current time. These were the very last exhibits I wrote, and those were sent literally as I was getting on the plane. This connects the upper levels to the excavated part of the building to a place called the Edge of Space, which is at the lower end of this cosmic connection. If you go out this way and then hang a left, you'll be at the cafe at the end of the universe, and then off to the right is the Stellar Emporium, the gift shop. Just outside the door is that transit corridor I told you about. So this is where this is going north-south. And then in particular, this is showing the sun transiting directly overhead. This is the astronomer who took the picture. His name is Giovanni Somoza, and he's one of their astronomers there. So this is a kind of a practical real-life application of astronomy. Of course, observing remains a huge part of the Griffith experience. This is the original Zeiss. People still line up to look through it. Griffith also has a solar telescope called the Triple Beam Celestat. and it shows live views of the sun throughout the day. So Giovanni took some pictures for me. Here it is a few days ago looking, the dome is open. And then these are the images that it sends down to a gallery where you can learn more about the sun. So that's the live image right there. And then there are other exhibits about the sun. Back indoors, we're in the Amundsen Hall of the Sky. One of the things that people don't really often realize is in astronomy that we can look at objects in the sky and learn about what they're made out of, and also where the elements that create everything, hydrogen, helium, oxygen, nitrogen, gold, everything, how they come from astrophysical processes. So this is kind of interesting. We wrangled over this for a long time, how we were going to show this. Every box here has a sample of its of the element that it's showing. So this has got a little hydrogen in here all the way down. I don't think we have really well shielded uranium and things like that in here, but this is a periodic table of the elements, and the wayside talks about where they come from. And there are interactives throughout the building as well, so you can interact with the exhibit in here. In the Hall of the Eye, the exhibits answer the 6 most asked questions by visitors about why do we have phases of the moon, why do day and night happen, why do we see the path of the sun and the stars do what they do across the sky, why do we have seasons, why do we have tides, and why do we have eclipses. So this is just 2 of them. You can walk up, press a little button, something will happen overhead, particularly in this one. It'll show you the phases of the moon. So then we have the newly added exhibition space called the Edge of Space, which shows us what the moon and meteorites and comets look like. We spent a tremendous amount of time on these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 exhibits. There's another one over here, trying to get them right. And one family donated a tremendous number of their meteorites that they'd collected. So there's a little panel dedicated to them as well. Then deep underground, that big 30,000 cubic yard excavation I showed you, this is called the Gunther Depths of Space. And it features the worlds of the solar system. Up here is the edge of space in the back that you can see. But over here, then we see all the planets to scale. This was going to be a Mars exhibit here that's now just a place for people to sit and kind of rest. And then down here is a little exhibit about each of the planets with interactives and push buttons and things like that. Here's an oblique view of the planets and Albert Einstein. He's showing us something we're about to see. But before we get there, you see these scales right here. You can stand in front of each one of these on a scale and weigh yourself on that planet. So Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars. You go in through a door over here, you can see right in here, here's the old planetarium instrument that they took out. Anyway, Albert is showing us something that if you hold your hand out about a foot in front of your face with your finger held the way he is, it'll cover up an area of space that's very small. But they took a picture of that area of space, and it's now reproduced on the wall that we're about to look at. So this is a 3,600 pixel wide version of something called the Big Picture, which itself is a 2.46 gigapixel image taken by the Samuel Ocean Telescope at Palomar Mountain near San Diego. It's what we call a deep image of a very small area of sky, and deep means the longer we look at it, the more we can see, the farther out. So as I mentioned, you could cover this area of sky with your finger held about 15 inches in front of your face. And at the time this was taken, it was the largest astronomical image ever produced. So let me give you a little close-up of it. This is a close-up of this area right here. This is a region called Markarian's Chain, which is a set of galaxies in part of the Virgo supercluster of galaxies, and they all lie about 110 million light years away from us. So the deeper you look into this image, the more you see. Farther past the Virgo supercluster, you're looking out to regions of space that contain very young galaxies that as they appeared perhaps 10 billion years ago. So the exhibit planners wanted to make this an exploration that people could do on their own. They could walk up to this picture, they could look at it with telescopes, they could touch it, whatever. And it was a big call. I mean, this is a huge, beautiful image. There are thousands of pictures of stars and galaxies and quasars and a couple of asteroids in there. All these things that you can look at. How do you reproduce it on a wall so that you can do that? Well, the big picture data was taken and recreated on panels made of fired porcelain. And this was done at a company called Windsor Fireform in Tumwater, Washington. And this is Dr. Krupp inspecting one of the panels. He flew up there like every week for several months, looking at each panel as it came out of the hopper. And it needed to be very high quality because we were using a very high resolution image, high resolution copy of the image. So he's looking at, it looks like might be part of Markarian's chain there. he's looking at it to make sure that it has reproduced accurately. And it was a 3-color process, but I don't know much more than that about how they did it. So the big picture is a mosaic of 114 tiles that stretch out across a width of 152 feet by 20 feet high. So here you see, here's Markarian's chain. This is right after they'd installed all the panels before they finished the building. So I know somebody will probably ask this. I'll tell you, the Palomar Quest survey camera that took this image has 162 millions in the detector array, at least it did at the time, and it was attached to the Samuel Ocean Telescope at Palomar. Here's a view of the big picture from the edge of space, or from that gallery up above. People walk right up to it. You can see over here on the right, they can touch it, they can talk about it. There are usually a couple of guides standing there. When I go out there, like to sit in that circular area and just listen to people talk about what they're looking at, because it tells me, if they get what we're doing, it tells me that what we wrote and what we told them is working. And they can also view it through these telescopes that are mounted up on the mezzanine to magnify their view. So, and yet there are almost always people lined up to look at these, and there's a little explanation of what you're going to see when you look through this telescope. And we talked about this a lot. You know, how many telescopes should we put in there? And we figured out we could probably fit 5 or 6 of them up there, and those are always being used. So I don't want to end this without a quick look at the planetarium, and there's another special theater in the facility. Griffith may be actually best known for its planetarium theater, either because of the visits that kids do or the laser shows. The current theater is now called the Samuel Ocean Planetarium, named after a fellow who made a lot of money in real estate and was madly in love with Griffith. And here's the entrance to the theater. There's another little rotunda overhead, sort of a compass rose. The theater's been outfitted with new seats, new dome, wall units. For those of you who used to come to the laserium shows, you probably remember the old walls, the wooden seats with the really god-awful headrest. Those are all gone, and it's much more comfortable in there. This is a 230-seat theater, or 290-seat theater. This is the old Mark IV projector that they took out, very similar to the one I learned on in college. Mine was a Mark VI. So this was removed during the renovation, and they put in the new flooring and everything, and this is what it was replaced with. Glamour shot of the new planetarium instrument. It's called the Zeiss Mark IX Universarium. And it's a star ball. It's on a lift. It's kind of cool if you ever get a tour of the building. You can go downstairs, and there's this big basement building and basement room, and this star ball just comes lumbering down on the lift. It uses fiber optics and lenses to project stars on a dome. And it works in conjunction with an Evans and Sutherland Digistar 6 program, and that's a computer graphics generating system. I actually have a Digistar 6 in my studio here. It comes with databases of stars, the Digistar does, of stars, planets, galaxies, videos, whatever you want. Those are created and sent to the dome through video projectors. The Digistar can also present pre-rendered video content projection mapped onto the dome. So those of you who go to Disney a lot, you know how they do the projection mapping onto the buildings. This is just on a dome, but same idea. And I think the current projectors are Christie Boxers. So this is a frame from their opening show called Centered in the Universe, which they still show. It's created by the Griffith staff. It still runs along with several other programs. They did a really cool one a few years ago when there was a big opera push in Los Angeles, and they did one about the Northern Lights called Light of the Valkyries. They're getting ready to premiere a new one about life in the universe. I mentioned earlier that all shows at Griffith are done live, and that tradition continues even with these video projections. Each show is made up of a combination of star fields from the Zeiss projector along with pre-rendered video scenes. A live presenter comes out and acts as a storyteller. So in this particular show, in Centered in the Universe, it starts out with the storyteller coming out from in back of the console with a globe in their hand. They walk around and they talk about how storytelling works, about how we've always told stories about the sky. And then from there, the show continues on, but the storyteller is telling the story as the video, in concert with the video. Each of those presenters is an actor, and many of them do have astronomy background. The other theater in the building is the Leonard Nimoy Event Horizon Theater, named for Mr. Nimoy. And he was a big fan of Griffith and a very generous donor to the Friends of the Observatory for this renovation. I believe he gave on the order of $2 million for this. So this is a lecture hall. They do live talks in here. They also broadcast talks from here via the web. So if you go to the Griffith website, you can find out when they're going to be doing their next talks. They have something called All Space Considered, which they give, I think, every couple of weeks or so. And you can watch it online. If you're a member of of Griffith Observatory Foundation, there are other member events that you can watch also, either live or online. So the observatory's director is Dr. Krupp, Dr. Edwin C. Krupp. He's been there since 1974, and he's shepherded the observatory through this modernization. He was the one that brought the internet up there, and he also wanted to look at having another brand new Zeiss projector in there, as well as the video. He did tell me a couple of times he was fairly old school, but he had his eyes opened when he saw what could be done with this technology, and he wanted it for his theater. So today, Griffith has just reopened after the pandemic. I don't think you probably want to go up there today, but probably starting Tuesday, anybody can go up there. Access is free to the building and to the exhibits, but you do pay to get into the planetarium show. And there is a charge for parking, which is imposed by the city. There's not a lot of parking up there, and I think it's probably starting at $8 to go up there and park. You can also hike up there, and I think you can still park at the Greek Theater and catch a shuttle, but I'm not sure. You'd have to check on that. Viewing through the telescopes is always free, and the observatory has many events throughout the year where the Los Angeles Astronomical Society will come up and set up telescopes as well on the front lawn. They also do eclipse gazing events. If there's something else like an occultation or something going on, they'll have an event. This is one of my favorite ones. One of the most exciting ones I ever remember seeing, and I had to watch this over the web because I was at home, was the landing of the Space Shuttle Endeavour in Los Angeles. And this was actually on its way to the Los Angeles Science Center, but they made an arrangement for it to fly twice over Griffith Observatory. And so their crowds were, I think Mark said there was something well over 5,000 people just in this area right up in here watching it, plus people spread out all over the grounds and the mountains to make the pilgrimage up to the mountain to see final flight as it went overhead. And I don't know if any of you watched this, but it was really moving. I really wished I'd been there. He did say that they didn't have anybody faint or pass out from lack of water, and it was a pretty hot day. But the crowds were just very respectful, very happy to see it, and then they all went home after it was done. So probably the most stunning view of city lights you can get is from Griffith. This is kind of ironic since these lights are really the bane of astronomy's existence. But Griffith really continues to provide looks through the telescope despite those lights. You can go up there and see a planet. Sometimes you can see some deep sky objects. If the marine layers moved in over the city, you can get a little bit better viewing. But it does maintain its mission to turn visitors into observers through the exhibits and astronomy programs. And they have planned to continue doing that as long as people will come up and see it. So with that, I'll end here. Griffith has an amazing history, and I hope that it will have an amazing future. There are people around the world who will tell you that they got their love of astronomy here, and some of them are world famous astronomers. In all my visits here for events, I've watched them at the exhibits. I've listened to them talk about them. I've talked to some of those people, and it's everybody from celebrities and politicians to regular folks. You know, if they grew up going here, they have a story to tell about going to Griffith. And if you ever get a chance to go up, you can ask your neighbor standing next to you, what do you like about this place? Because they really do like it. So I left this up for a little bit. See if you want to get a screen grab of these URLs. The first one's for Griffith. The second one's for my company. The third one is for the Griffith Observatory Foundation, which was FOTO, Friends of the Observatory. And they are continuing their membership drive. In fact, if you remember, you get to go there today and see it open, or tomorrow. I guess you can go then. Memberships, they just sent me my membership renewal. It's like $65 for a family to join. And you get some little goodies for it. But it's also to support their educational outreach. And just a little shameless hustling. These are the books that I've written. So I noticed Bill got to show off his books, so I'm showing off mine. With that, I'm really welcome any questions. Let me crash out of this and we'll do a Q&A. Stop share. All right.
Well, thank you much, Carolyn. It's really interesting. I was talking to my wife yesterday at dinner, saying, you see the building up there on the hill, and you don't realize that when they did we knew they were doing the remodeling. It was all closed, and you couldn't get up there forever. You had to make reservations for shuttles. but I had no idea they had taken the entire building and jacked it up to dig out underneath it. And, I can imagine again how the people were keeping their fingers crossed until they put that puppy back down. So,
Yeah. Well, I don't know how they got it back down, but boy, it was when they sent me in, I did not know about that part until I mean, they said, oh, we had to jack the building up. And I thought, oh, it wasn't until I put that hard hat on, and I think we had that vest on and stuff. And we walked under there and I was like, holy cow, because just on the other side of the building is a hill. And if
yeah,
anything had happened, that whole thing would have slid down the hill.
yeah, would have been the Griffith Lower Observatory.
The Griffith pile, I think. Although I don't know how much that would have broken up. I mean, foot thick. It's more than a foot thick in some places. The concrete pour. The interesting thing too is this was built during the Depression, essentially. So I'm sure it provided a lot of work for people who really needed it. But like so many other places that were built during that time, it was built really well.
Yeah. Well, the last time we were up there, we were up to see Dr. Carpenter speak. So we'll have to go back again and see some more of the exhibits. And that particular time, it was a thing that was really full, and Kenneth was able to arrange for us to get parking up near there. So we came in, ran into the show, and then ran back out because we knew everybody else was going to be going down that same one road at night. So we didn't see much of the new exhibits and all your wonderful
Yeah.
writing. We have to go back and peruse it.
Well, I would give it a couple weeks if I were you. I think they're open to the public starting Tuesday, and they're open every weekday except Monday. I think they're dark on Mondays for cleaning and repairing and all that.
Well, somebody here mentions within 3 hours of visiting LA did his three highest priority goals: In-N-Out Burger, Mulholland Drive, and the Griffith Observatory. So yeah, that's the LA experience in a nutshell.
The last time I came out there, I think I was out there for the woman who headed up the photo for a long time was retiring. In fact, there's a trail named for her now. It's the Camille Lombardo Trail. It goes from the museum or the planetarium down through, I think, below the Hollywood sign. Anyway, the first thing I said was, I know I'm already going to Griffith and I spent a lot of time there, so can I go to the Huntington instead? So we ended up doing the Huntington and the Getty and then going back up to Griffith. But he works there, so Mark picked me up at Burbank, and that's what we did.
Right. Carol mentioned an interesting talk about a Los Angeles landmark. I remember visiting the observatory as a child. Did you go there, Carol, with your folks, or was it one of the many field trips that Caroline mentioned?
No, I think, well, maybe we went with school. I don't remember, but I think more it was with family. And I went to the planetarium shows, and I think I even saw the laserium. But
You and I went to that during our Disney days.
oh, okay. Anyway, it's
Well, and I actually never saw a laserium show there. I bet everybody remembered that. I saw laserium here in Colorado that played at Gates Planetarium. So I've been involved in planetariums since probably longer than you want to know, but 79, 78, something like that, and then went to work at full time at one in 88. And then my husband and I, we do content for Full Dome Theaters, and so it was kind of ironic that they wouldn't let me near the new planetarium show at Griffith. They already had somebody working on that, and I found out later if they had, I never would have gotten the exhibits done because it was a real time sink to get it done. But so here I was writing exhibits, and somebody else was doing the planetarium show.
I remember Laserium changed the music at one point. They went, for version one of the show to version two. And it was just like with Disneyland when you change, the electrical parade or the astral orbiters or everything. All of a sudden, all the people are yelling and screaming about bring back the original, bring back the original. So it just proves that what you do, you can't change anything. Somebody's going to object.
Yeah. No, it's and we knew Ivan Dreyer. In fact, last time we saw him was not long before he died, and he was just, he had these all over the place for a long time. It was like what everybody identified, Dark Side of the Moon, or whatever. Let's do these shows. And so when I was first working at the planetarium, we had our own home built laser show, and people would come in and say, "When are you bringing Laserium back?" So I worked at the University of Colorado's planetarium for a long time.
I should bring it back. Is it another extra use for, totally different paying audience?
I think some places would. Griffith will not. They and St. Louis has a planetarium, the St. Louis Science Center. And when I worked with them on an opening show, and they basically wanted to turn it from what they called thugs on drugs to science education. And Griffith has never said anything like that to me, but I think that's sort of their attitude too, is this is for science education. And I think in St. Louis, it was a problem that Forest Park there was being used as a kind of a drug distribution center for a while. And they wanted to renovate that whole area and make it more family friendly.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't know how many people outside the LA area know just how huge Griffith Park is. You know, in the film they were, and Carolyn talked about things like the Greek theaters down below. You also have the LA Zoo, both the old zoo, the new zoo, Travel Town, you know, the live steamers. It's a totally massive park. Again,
Yeah.
Carolyn mentioned the merry-go-round, and you happen to just wonder, as you were mentioning about Walt sitting there, you know, with his kids, you were just thinking, gee, if he didn't have this to go to and he wasn't sitting on that bench, would we have Disneyland? So it's
Yeah,
interesting how
yeah.
things connect.
Well, I noticed Greg's asking, have they produced any soundtrack recordings of planetarium presentations? I don't know. Griffith has not. I mean, that's what my husband and I do for our business is we actually distribute the content. We get asked occasionally for soundtracks by people who have been to the show and they want to see it, they want to have it at home, that sort of thing. And now with the age of you know, YouTube and things like that, we can put our shows up. The problem is that they're created in a spherical format, and then you have to kind of flatten them to put them on the dome, uh, to put them on, you know, YouTube or something like that. It's going to look a little warped unless we go back and completely reproduce from scratch using flat, quote, flat images, you know, to create an HD version or something like that.
I'm sure.
Did that answer your question, Greg?
Sure, some of the Imagineers are already dreaming about how they could take your spherical shows and turn it into a HD, you know, YouTube presentation.
Well, we do. I mean, we do that. I can, you know, I'm happy to send anybody a link to show you what we do. But I do know that Griffith has had some conversations with Pixar about working with them. The problem is Pixar, it's not really a problem. Pixar has its own tools. You know, like everybody uses Adobe Photoshop or they use After Effects or they use Premiere or whatever they're using for production. And Pixar has its own tools. And so they're not always compatible with what those of us outside of Pixar use for production tools, for animations and things like that. I don't know all the details. I just remember the curator telling me one time Pixar wanted to bring some things up, and it was like, well, what'd you create them in, and how can we do this? And they couldn't just bring them up; they had to go through some gyrations to get it to open up in the programs that they were using at Griffith for production.
You know, it's actually interesting you said that when you were talking about the panels, you know, being designed to last for years and that sort of thing. I was just wondering, you know, with the way technology changes, I assume they have all the computer files. You know, if one of them wears out because 8,000 people touch it, rub it, or whatever, they can make another one. But at times people find out we want to go and recreate something or do something, and there's no way to read the disk or to output the stuff anymore. So I just hope they managed to archive that in some format that they could reproduce those panels if needed.
Well, I don't know exactly how they stored them at Palomar. Maybe Ken might know more, but there are headers in the files that allow you to open them up and you know, that give you data about how the file was compiled. Ken, would you know how they did that at Palomar?
I know that happened with Pixar. They wanted to go back and do something with one of their very early movies, and turned out they had, you know, all the modern stuff couldn't read all the old stuff. So how do you recreate all those digital files that you terabytes of data and no programs to read them anymore?
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, what would they use, Ken? Would it be?
My guess is they're probably IRAF files, but who knows
Yeah,
what they did in terms of working with the photo people or actually printing. They may have been asked for something very specific.
Yeah, I don't know either. That was all in progress when I came in, but I know that they had several iterations of some of those panels. They did one or two panels first, one that was not very populated with objects, and then another one, like I think center of Markarian's chain, where they, you know, highly populated, so they could see what the difference was in terms of reproduction. And I mean, anytime you print anything, whether it's to porcelain or paper, you're going to have some loss. It always looks great on the screen, in other words. And then once you get it up on the wall, when you go and look at this and you go up right next to that picture, it's amazingly detailed. And so whatever they did it right.
Great. Dave English,
Yeah.
hand up.
Yeah, Dave.
There we go. Now you can hear me.
Yes.
So just as kind of as an aside, when the Lion King was re-released and a stereo version of the original animation was done. By the way, somebody is typing.
Yes.
And they're not muted, so.
It's Carolyn and she didn't turn her mic off.
It's okay.
You have a good mic pickup on your keyboard, apparently.
So
I have a really good
Really
studio
today.
mic.
So that was one of the, I mean, there's actually a paper that the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences published this paper called The Digital Dilemma, and it deals with how you archive it and so that you make sure that future generations, much less somebody a year from now, but 20 years from now, can recreate that. Well, in the case of The Lion King, since I was there at the time, I have credit on the original animated film. We were using a new system we had developed called CAPS, and we archived our data on exabyte tapes. And so we had 50,000, I think that's the numbers right, 50,000 exabyte tapes. Anyway, thousands of them. So when they wanted to redo The Lion King, guess what? They were able to pull out those tapes, re-ingest the data, create the stereo image, and re-release the film. And much credit goes to Mark Kimball, who is a colleague who worked on that project. And coming up with, I mean, we had this jukebox that you loaded up with tapes, and there were barcodes on the tapes, and it would go through and archive every night all the stuff you were doing. Because
Wow.
again, we were working with 1.5 terabytes of data in those days, and this was in the mid 80s. That was unheard of. I mean, it was a lot.
I can imagine the size of the drives that you had, or they're on tapes, right?
No, they were on drives. We had we had 1.5 terabytes of storage, online storage, in 7 racks. There were 70-inch tall cabinets, and in order to get the speed of be able to pull the stuff off the drive, we had 4 drives in a tray that were striped. So you could write to all those drives at the same time and read from all those drives. And then in order to get the data from those arrays, it was the arrays were in the middle of our computer room, and we could only have 10 or 11 foot cables. That was a maximum length the cable could run from that to the Pixar image computers that were clustered around there. And they were designed to process images. That was their Pixar built hardware in those days. And that was what made that system work, because when the painters were painting an image, you couldn't have it kind of stream across. You had to have it blast up there. And so they could work on it in real time. So that was a big challenge. But what's relevant to this is that coming up with a way that you could store it and be able to retrieve it later. And that is still a problem today, because as we know, the DVD that you pop into your player 5 years or 10 years from now, you will not be able to, likely you won't be able to play it. And I wish I knew the solution, I'd be rich, but we don't know the solution. We just know it's a problem.
One of the things that we face in distributing planetarium shows is that every year or so people upgrade their projection systems, and that changes the video that what we have to deliver to them. So then they have to come back to us for another video, and the people with the slides haven't even gotten into that area. I mean, there's still planetariums that have slide projectors and they don't have the video, or they have a single video projector, but the big dome painting video systems cost quite a bit. And then it also has really kind of ratcheted up our game in terms of what we have to produce. I just finished production on a show about exoplanets, and we already had visuals produced. If we had to do that now and find somebody who's willing to do it during a pandemic, it would cost quite a bit more than it did just to do slides.
Well, it is a problem, but problems do have solutions. And it's a matter of paying attention to, oh my gosh, how am I going to protect this? I was part of a team of academy scientists that investigated, was part of the, every year there's Academy Awards given for technology. And Adobe applied for recognition for Photoshop, which was written back in the late 70s. And John, if you look at the splash screen for it, you'll see that John Knoll and his brother have credit. Well, they brought into our we had this meeting where we brought them in to talk about how they developed it, and we were trying to see, was it developed for the Motion Picture Academy? Because if it's not, then it's not eligible. But John Knoll brought in a Macintosh, and he ran version 1.0 with Photoshop on it.
Yeah.
And it was amazing. There it was in its infancy. But the point is, he kept changing the code to a format that he could finally read. And it was very cool to see him launch it and, move the mouse around the screen. And here we are, many, many, many years later.
Oh, it's our right hand. Yeah.
So it's one of those things that you need to pay attention to. And the rest of us shouldn't have to think about it, because we should, like your presentation today was amazing. And I learned so many things. I can hardly wait to go there. But I went there as a child.
Okay. Tell them I sent you.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you.
We need to have one of our WED alumni lunches up at their cafeteria, maybe.
Yeah, tell me, I'll be there.
That'd be cool.
Out. It's only a 2-hour flight.
Mention it to Debbie. She's always looking for a venue. Maybe we do a field trip up there. Don, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I've got to leave here in just a second, but I just wanted to say, my wife and I visited the planetarium about 5 years ago. I think I told you that. And I still have memories of looking at that big picture when I realized what it was, which it's kind of nice because the reveal of that doesn't come right away when you enter the hall. And you realize what you're looking at. I don't think there's been anything I've ever seen that communicated to me so well the scope and size of the universe and, how we fit in it as that image did.
Mm-hmm.
When I looked and saw all those galaxies and all those stars, I went, what, all of that in the space, I can see it's, this big. It was very, very effective. And you folks did your job extremely well. I can remember that day like it was yesterday. So I just want to say thank you, a great presentation, and thank you for all the work you did there.
As
Thank
Don
you.
was mentioning about that picture, Carolyn told me something the other day. You might want to talk about your Einstein statue, what you had to do to get the rights to use it.
Oh, yeah. So there's a university in Israel that owns the rights to any image of Albert Einstein, except like public, UPI pictures and stuff. And we had to negotiate with them, and I don't remember how much we ended up paying, but it was quite a bit to be able to build that statue. And it went to the last minute, the negotiations to get that. So when Einstein died, he willed all of that stuff to that university, and that's how his estate was handled.
That's a little sort of insider detail I find fascinating, because you see the statue, you just think, hey, I want an Albert Einstein statue sitting in my front lawn. I'll just go off and make one, right? Not realizing that you can just make your own Albert Einstein statue. So,
well, the cool thing is, if you do a search on Griffith Observatory in Google and then just look at videos or images, you're going to run across everybody sits next to him and puts their arm around him and pats him on the head, and they do all this stuff. It's just something that people relate to, and it's pretty amazing how that worked. But yeah, there was this whole kind of lengthy period of time we weren't sure we were going to get the permission. There's also a moon rock in the exhibit somewhere, and I didn't show you the moon, but there's a moon rock there that had to be brought up from Houston in a briefcase locked to somebody's wrist. Flight down, and the woman who flew down to get us, like, I really seriously, I've got to lock this to my wrist, and they did, and she had to fly down and fly back the same day to get it.
We'll get to you in 1 second, Joey. Greg Airbar mentioned if anybody's interested in cool space-related albums, he put a link up there.
Cool. Yeah, I copied that.
Right.
Actually, Greg also mentioned that you made a very nice comment about these things lasting a lifetime. Some years ago, I wrote a little show called Larry Cat in Space that was for a school, and everybody started buying it for their theaters, and it's still out there. People are still showing it. when they're open. And we're now hearing from second generation users of kids who went to the planetarium, saw Larry Cat in space, went to school. They're now running their own planetariums and they're running Larry Cat in space. So in that sense, I kind of feel like a Disney person, it's like, oh my God, I remember doing the teacups. They're still there, kind of thing,
Joey.
Hi, Carolyn, great show. I loved it.
Thank you.
I'd like to volunteer to have the moon rock fastened to my arm, and I'll bring it to my house. It can stay there for about a month. My question is, when they jacked up the building, were any artifacts found underneath?
I don't think so, because they had to blast solid rock out of there in
Okay,
some areas of that. So I don't think there probably was. I do, now that you mention it, remember somebody mentioning that they had to have a city archaeologist come up.
Yeah.
But if you look at the geology of that, it's mostly hard rock, but there is some, what they call a bajada, sort of an outflow of material from a higher mountain that just deposits itself down. And there was probably some of that. That's what they were able to excavate, but they had to actually blast underneath the building. So there was pretty solid rock there.
Wow. Okay.
That's a good question, though. Yeah.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Yeah.
Well, again, Carol and I were talking the other day, planetariums can make a big impact. I still remember the Hayden Planetarium in New York. I'm sure a lot of my other fellow New Yorkers or ex-New Yorkers all went there. And I remember walking in the front door and there was a giant iron ore meteorite just right in front of you. And, I think I was 7 years old or something when I first saw it. And I thought that, wow, that used to fly through outer space and it came crashing down here. I remember, I think I, was worried another one's going to come crash down on our house some night. But I still remember, all the places I've been over the last 69 years, that Hayden Planetarium was just a eye opener. When they turned on their Zeiss thing, was probably a Mark 1 or 2 or something. But wow, Carol.
I can't find my raised hand. It just also pointed out to me, I have lived in Los Angeles most of my life. I never knew who Mr. Griffith was. I just assumed Griffith Park and Griffith Planetarium. I mean, I never thought about it. And that just makes me think of all the places that we know by people's names in Los Angeles that maybe we should go and look up and see what the origin is.
It's interesting. I didn't know much about Getty until I visited the villa.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It
Same
probably
thing.
never occurred to you, and it never occurred to me until today. So it's kind of a neat search. It's like Ancestry.
In a way, yeah. I mean, in Griffith, there are still members of the Griffith family around. I think one or two of them are on the board, I think, or at least are members of Griffith Observatory Foundation. For a while, they weren't terribly interested, but then the younger generation has come in and said, yeah, we want to be more involved. But they, for a long time, helped guide the affairs of the observatory. And I think part of that, too, is, when you give back to the community, there might be sort of an impetus to kind of whitewash the history a little bit. But I mean, everybody kind of knew he was a wild ass, in some ways. I mean, you shoot your wife in the head? Come on. They don't talk much about that in the museum.
I was one that didn't. So I appreciate learning something more about my city.
Yeah. No, and I think you can Google him and there's a little bit of information about him in Wikipedia, but there's other articles about him.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think
Park in our street on Melviny Park. It's the same O'Melveny for the O'Melveny and Myers law firm that I worked at.
Oh.
So,
well, for me, when I come out to Los Angeles, I mean, obviously there are places that I watched on TV when I was a kid because I didn't grow up in Los Angeles. I think the first time I went was in the 70s, maybe. I was out there for a meeting during college. But I was a big Firesign Theater fan, and they used to reference all kinds of things. And so did Stan Freberg about Los Angeles, Pico and Alvarado, and all these things. And so when I'm driving around and I find Pico and Alvarado, oh, I remember this. It's not at all what I had in my head, but there it is, or Sunset Strip or whatever, So then you're kind of motivated to learn more about it.
You have to come out and take the Slauson cutoff.
I did. And also, what's that little canyon, Mulholland Drive. So we knew some people that lived up in that area, and I drove up that little tiny windy canyon one day to try and find their place. And I always thought, there can't be any like mountain roads here. And here they are in the middle of a city, this mountain road. It was pretty cool.
Yeah. Well, thank you much for doing this. I think people enjoyed the trip.
Let me give you, if anybody has any questions, let me give you my email address. It's in the chat. Because I'm happy to answer further questions. There's a lot more you can go into: the history of the planetarium, history of observatories. My last book was History of Observatories, and that got me into a lot about I think probably what really got me interested in that was all of the history that I had to do research when I was writing the exhibits about the history of astronomy in California.
Yeah, it's fascinating. We've been up to Mount Wilson, just for a nice drive and sometimes to get away from the heat.
It's open to the public now.
Is it? Well,
everything's reopening.
Up there, it wasn't. It was big chain link fence, and you could have picnic lunch outside, but come in, don't touch, sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been up there a couple times.
Next week, we will return to the wonderful world of World's Fairs in some shape, form, or fashion. But I think this was fascinating, and appreciate the time and effort you put into it.
Okay. Well, thank you. Good to see everybody.
Great. And everybody, if you grab Carolyn's email, if you have any other questions, or if you go to LochNessProductions.com, it's we were chatting the other day. It's a family-owned business and everything. You might be interested in some of the books and things he's done. So shameless plug to go over and explore a little bit more about the history of stuff.
Yeah, no, I did. I look back on it after 44 years of doing it. It's like this road that didn't go like this. It was like this, going all over the place. It's been a lot of fun. Always around astronomy, though.
That's fascinating.
One other little tidbit of info. One of the first times when I started going to Griffith again a lot in modern times was right after Apple had put out a new set of maps electronically, and they weren't ready for prime time, shall we say. Yeah. And I was trying to follow it up to the observatory, and it sent me through this residential neighborhood, winding streets, really hard to get to anywhere, dumped me at the end of a street with this huge canyon with the observatory sitting very nicely on the other side. And it said, "Park here and walk." And as I got out of the car,
I know where you were. I know where you were.
This guy comes out on his balcony, and I swear he had a shotgun and looked like, he'd seen one too many Apple user that day going through here. So I got in a car and scooted back out of the way. And on the way down, discovered that it's actually the same area. It's where the Ennis house, I think it is, the Frank Lloyd Wright house that's used in a lot of TV shows as well. So, that made it all worthwhile, even almost getting shocked because seeing the Ingalls house was very neat, except that there's no place to park there. I mean, it's really narrow streets.
Well, during right after reopening, you couldn't drive up there, so you had to take those shuttles. And all the people in Los Feliz were just not very friendly at all. If you got lost, boy, it wasn't fun. So
the other hint is,
I tried to go to a railroad museum on Long Island, and I got a GPS, I think a little Garmin or something, punched it in. The address, drove up, and I go, wow, that's a weird place that this have a railroad museum. I can't even imagine they ever had trains here. I finally get to some guy's house, and he's got a sign in his front yard. It says, "This is not the railroad museum. I do not know where it is."
There is a road that you can go. There's another road to get to the observatory from the San Fernando Valley side. And it leaves, if you go to Travel Town and then you go into the mountains, and there's this windy road, and eventually you get to the top of the hill and go through a tunnel, and you're at the observatory. So it's not widely advertised. And I used to go up there as a kid and ride my bike coming down that hill. And actually the brakes failed once. So it was an exciting ride.
Antonio Villaraigosa told a story during the opening about how he used to go up there as a kid. They would go for their visiting field trips, and one time they were all in this old station wagon, 8 kids and mom and dad in the front and all this, and it broke down halfway up the road. Not that one you were on, but the one going to the observatory. And they were so anxious to get up there, the kids all just ran up the hill. And then they had to wait for somebody to come and tow the car away. But this was the night that the opening happened, and all these celebrities were up there talking about their experiences, and his was probably the most familiar to so many families. You get halfway up the road and the station wagon breaks down.
Well, I used to ride my bike when I was at the studio. We would basically take our bikes right up to Griffith Park, try to do entire circle of the park and then get back to the studio, shower, go back to your desk. And one day we decided to see how fast you can come down that hill that you're mentioning, Dave. You'll be pleased to know you're not the only one who had brake issues, because I was coming down this thing like a bat out of hell and I realized I better start slowing down. And I didn't have disc brakes on my bike. I had, the rubber ones that would push it off against
yeah.
the wheels. So I'm coming down trying to stop. And I said, oh, man, I'm smelling burning rubber. This is not good.
Yeah, I've been on that road. That was in fact how we found it the first time, because we didn't realize we were on the wrong side. So we went up that road and we barely made it in time for the show.
Yeah, it's a hell of a ride.
Yeah.
I learned so many things today about it that it was just wonderful. Thank you so much.
Aaron,
Thank you.
Card?
Yeah, real quick. Well, I don't know if you can see this. Yeah, you can. And
Oh, yeah.
yeah, Carol behind you also. My question was that after they did the underground renovation, the spire that's right behind you in your photograph, and that's located on the map here, was it relocated in the exact location that it was before they did the renovation? Or was
I don't think it ever moved. From the one picture, it didn't look to me like it ever moved. I think they just boxed it up and covered it so that it wasn't harmed by the renovation.
Oh, so it never moved
I think
at
it
all.
stayed in the same place. Yeah.
They only
They never
excavated behind it.
removed it
Yeah.
to do the underground, and then they relocated it.
No,
again?
no, not at all.
Oh,
No, it
okay.
ends just before that. So it's still in the same place.
Okay, just curious.
Yeah.
Other than that, very good presentation. Thank you. I
Thank
enjoyed
you.
it.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to get back out there. I'm anxious to travel again and get back out there.
Well, come
I
out.
will be there this fall probably. So.
Where in Colorado did you say you worked in planetariums?
University of Colorado Fisk Planetarium is where I got
Boulder?
started.
In
Yeah.
Boulder? Oh, okay. Okay.
Okay, well, thanks again. I didn't
All
know
right,
what
thank
dog
you.
you're yelling at, but they didn't deliver the mail today, so something else is upsetting her.
Yeah, Bill, if you can send me the chat, that'd be great. I think I've copied everything, but just in case.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll grab the
All right.
text. Yeah.
Thank you. All right.
Great,
See you
thanks.
guys.
Hope to see
Bye.
you next week, and we will have another World's Fair presentation. Thanks all. Oh, and Jim Brown, and we'll get in touch with you during the week to try to follow up on some of your suggestions. So I've made a note here to get in touch with you. Thanks much. I'll talk to you later.
Bye.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Carolyn.